As we enter this next chapter, we return to Paya Lebar Airport not simply as a place of memory, but as a site of continuing national meaning. What stands before us is more than aviation heritage. It is a historic airfield whose runway, control tower, hangars, taxiways, and operational layout still reflects Singapore's long tradition of planning, discipline, readiness, and strategic foresight. In this episode, Le Premier Base presents a wider public case for understanding Paya Lebar in its full significance. Under total defense, its importance lies in war reserve capability, the principle that a nation must preserve credible strategic options before crisis, not after. Under safety, its lessons also extend into the language of command and control. In the civilian and commercial aviation world, this is often understood through C3I: command, control, communications, and intelligence. It refers to the disciplined coordination of people, procedures, information, and decision-making needed to keep complex air operations safe, lawful, and reliable. In the military context, this broadens into C4 ISR: command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This does not require the disclosure of sensitive operations. For public understanding, it simply means that modern national readiness depends not only on aircraft and runways, but on the ability to see clearly, communicate accurately, decide lawfully, and act in time. In that sense, aviation safety is never just technical. It is also procedural, organizational, and ethical, grounded in standard operating procedures, lawful conduct, trained judgment, and institutional discipline. Under human governance, the future relevance of this site may also be understood through the GEN5AI, Layer 6, Control Tower Architecture. In today's era of AI, 5G, XR, simulation, and robotics, many citizens are still learning how advanced systems are structured. One useful public reference comes from Jensen Huang, founder and CEO of NVIDIA, who has recently described AI through a widely discussed 5-layer stack framework. NVIDIA's own materials present that 5-layer model as a way of understanding how modern AI systems are built from infrastructure upward into applications. Le Premier Base adopts that broad educational logic and then extends it further. It proposes a Gen 5 AI Layer 6 above the 5-layer AI stack, a safety and human governance layer that preserves accountable human judgment over increasingly powerful digital systems. It asks a simple but vital question. Once machines can process more data, simulate more scenarios, and assist more decisions, who remains responsible? The answer must remain the human being. Not human judgment removed by technology, but human judgment strengthened by technology. As set out through the National White Paper and Addenda series, this Gen 5 extension has already been notified across the relevant national policy chain, including PMO-linked stakeholders, as part of the broader framework for governance, education, national resilience, and future international intellectual property positioning. And through Gen 5 flight simulation, AI, 5G, XR, and robotics, this heritage is no longer static. It becomes a platform for lifelong learning, experiential national education, and intergenerational understanding, helping the public appreciate aviation, resilience, governance, and national continuity in ways conventional classroom teaching alone may not easily achieve. This is not merely about remembrance or redevelopment preference. It is about whether institutions entrusted with planning, defense, and national stewardship are prepared to recognize an existential asset before it is diluted, fragmented, or lost. Having established why Paya Lebar matters, we now turn to an important public fact. The recognition of Paya Lebar's heritage value did not begin only from outside government. It has already appeared within Singapore's own planning discourse. On the 31st of January 2020, URA's Concept Master Plan material invited the public to reimagine Paya Lebar through heritage, identity, and new possibilities, including the runway itself, and most notably the terminal building, control tower, and hangars. This is significant because it shows that the preservation of Paya Lebar's core aviation character was never beyond the boundaries of serious planning thought. It was already recognized as part of the site's meaning, and that matters for public understanding. For too long, redevelopment discussions are often framed as though demolition, fragmentation, or total erasure are the only practical pathways. But the planning record itself suggests otherwise. As Addendum 1 makes clear, the URA-linked Paya Rambla concept demonstrated that keeping the runway intact as a heritage landscape and public asset is both civilian valid and planning feasible. It also demonstrated that preservation is not the opposite of development. Higher density growth can still occur in surrounding parcels, while the runway geometry, aviation spine, and identity of the site remain legible to future generations. In other words, this is not a debate between nostalgia and progress. It is a question of whether planning can be intelligent enough to preserve what is irreplaceable while still accommodating what is necessary. For the public, that distinction is vital, because once a runway, tower, terminal, and hangar system are broken apart, their value as an integrated aviation landscape is not easily recovered. And for the institutions involved, URA, MND, and MINDEF, the implication is equally clear. If heritage value has already been acknowledged, then the next responsibility is to evaluate the site in full, not only as urban land, but as a national asset with continuity, educational, safety, and war reserve capability implications. This is why Paya Lebar must be seen not as a closed chapter, but as a strategic landscape whose meaning has already been recognized and now requires the courage to be carried through. What began as heritage recognition now moves into the realm of formal national evaluation. This slide marks an important threshold. The case for Paya Lebar Airport has not been left as a personal opinion, a nostalgic reflection, or an informal public suggestion. It has been structured, documented, and submitted through a national white paper for evaluation by the relevant institutions, including MND and URA. That matters for the public, because it means the conversation has already advanced beyond whether Paya Lebar is historically significant. The real question now is whether Singapore is prepared to assess, with seriousness and foresight, the full value of this airfield as a continuing national asset. The white paper does not argue for isolated preservation of selected buildings alone. It argues for the adaptive reuse of Paya Lebar Airport in its entirety. That includes the runway, the taxiways, the aprons, the control tower, the hangars, and the wider operational geometry that together give the site its meaning, capability, and integrity. This is a crucial distinction, because once an airport is broken into fragments, its heritage may still be remembered, but its operational logic, its training value, and its strategic usefulness are far harder to recover. The proposal therefore goes beyond memory. It asks whether the full 3.8-kilometer runway, preserved within ICAO obstacle clearance principles, can continue to serve Singapore in new ways, through heritage, education, simulation, resilience planning, and war reserve capability. For viewers unfamiliar with these terms, this is not an attempt to freeze the past. It is an attempt to adapt a historic aviation system responsibly so that its value can be carried forward into a different era. That is why the proposal is anchored by the Gen 5 flight simulation, 5G, XR, AI, and robotics architecture. Not as a decorative add-on, but as the mechanism that transforms preserved infrastructure into living national utility. Through lifelong learning, experiential education, public awareness, and future-ready skills. And this is also where institutional responsibility becomes clearer. If the white paper has already been submitted, and if the strategic, educational, heritage, and WRC dimensions have already been formally set out, then silence becomes harder to justify. For MND, URA, and MINDEF, the issue is no longer whether the idea exists. It is whether the idea will be examined with the seriousness that a national asset of this scale deserves. This is why Paya Lebar must now be evaluated not as surplus land awaiting disposal, but as an integrated airfield whose value may yet prove greater in preservation than in erasure. To understand why Paya Lebar matters, we must first understand what aviation made possible for Singapore. For a small island with no natural hinterland, aviation was never a luxury. It was a strategic enabler. It connected Singapore to the region, to the world, and to opportunities far beyond its physical size. It accelerated trade, movement, skills, confidence, and national reach. In time, aviation became more than transport. It became part of how Singapore grew, economically, institutionally, and internationally. But infrastructure alone does not explain that success. What truly mattered were the lessons aviation carried with it: precision, discipline, training, safety, command responsibility, and the quiet professional culture that allows complex systems to function reliably under pressure. That is why this story is not only about aircraft, terminals, or runways. It is also about the formation of values. The values that shape pilots, controllers, engineers, planners, ground crews, and institutions. And that is why Paya Lebar Airport and its control tower remains central to this story. Paya Lebar was not merely a physical location in Singapore's aviation timeline. It was one of the places where aviation capability became lived experience. A place where systems, standards, and people came together. A place where the nation's aviation culture was not only observed, but practiced. As Addendum 1 makes clear, what remains at Paya Lebar is not nostalgia, but evidence of a place that shaped real people and real capability. And that is precisely why its lessons should not end with photographs or memorial plaques. They should continue to inspire future generations through living forms of learning, simulation, and public education. For the public, this is the deeper message. When a nation preserves aviation heritage properly, it is not preserving concrete alone. It is preserving memory, standards, skills, and civic confidence. And for institutions such as MINDEF, URA, and MND, that raises a serious responsibility. If aviation helped build Singapore's connectivity, growth, and opportunity, then the places that carry that history must be evaluated with more than land efficiency alone. They must also be judged by what they can still teach, still symbolize, and still contribute. This is why Paya Lebar remains central, not only to Singapore's aviation past, but to how that legacy may still serve the future. If heritage is to remain meaningful, it cannot be left as a static memory alone. It must be activated. That is where Le Premier Base enters the story, not as a museum of nostalgia, but as a living platform for immersive aviation learning, public understanding, and future-facing education. This is important for the public to understand, because preserving an airfield, a control tower, or a runway in physical form is only one part of preservation. The deeper challenge is how to make that heritage speak again, in ways that younger generations can experience, understand, and carry forward. That is the role of Gen 5. Through multi-aircraft flight simulation, AI, 5G, XR, and robotics, aviation heritage is no longer confined to archives, photographs, or display panels. It becomes participatory. It becomes experiential. It becomes a structured way of learning how aviation systems work, how decisions are made, how safety is maintained, and how command responsibility is exercised. In this sense, simulation is not entertainment. It is a powerful educational medium. It allows the public, including youth, students, families, and future learners, to encounter aviation as a lived system of discipline, teamwork, procedure, judgment, and national purpose. And in the present era of AI, 5G, XR, and intelligent systems, this matters even more, because lifelong learning is no longer optional. Citizens must increasingly understand not only technology itself, but also the human values that must guide its use. That is why Gen 5 should be understood as more than a simulator environment. It is a public-facing learning architecture, one that can help connect aviation heritage with digital literacy, AI awareness, experiential education, and human governance. In practical terms, it allows preserved infrastructure such as Paya Lebar to serve again, not only as a historic landmark, but as a national learning environment. This is especially meaningful in Singapore, where education, preparedness, and capability building have always been part of national resilience. So the question is no longer whether aviation heritage should merely be remembered. The question is whether it can be reactivated in ways that continue to teach, inspire, and prepare. And that is exactly where Le Premier Base offers a compelling public pathway. It transforms preserved aviation heritage from something looked at into something experienced, from something admired into something understood, and from something historic into something that still contributes. For institutions responsible for planning, defense, education, and national development, this should matter. Because once the possibility of meaningful activation is visible, the argument for total erasure becomes much harder to defend. We now come to a technical idea that is central to the future of Paya Lebar Airport. It is called ICAO, Obstacle Limitation Surfaces, or OLS. In simple terms, OLS refers to the protected three-dimensional airspace around a runway that helps ensure aircraft can approach, depart, and operate safely. For the general public, this means an airport is never only its runway on the ground. It is also the safeguarded airspace above and around it. That airspace must be understood, protected, and managed if the aerodrome is to remain aviation capable. This is why preservation cannot be reduced to buildings alone. A terminal may be retained, a control tower may be photographed, a hangar may be admired. But if the operational airspace envelope is lost, then the airport's true aviation function is no longer intact. That is why OLS matters. It defines the relationship between runway capability, obstacle control, flight safety, and land use planning. And this is especially relevant for Singapore, because Singapore is not only adapting to these revised ICAO standards, it has also played a leadership role in the international OLS revision process. As set out in Addendum 1, Singapore tabled the relevant working paper at the 42nd ICAO Assembly in July 2025, and the revised OLS standards were adopted in March 2025, became effective in August 2025, and will apply globally from November 2030. That is a significant public fact, because it means the discussion around Paya Lebar is no longer simply historical or conceptual. It sits directly within an evolving international regulatory framework that Singapore itself has helped shape. And under that revised framework, the strategic case for retaining Paya Lebar as a runway-capable, obstacle-compliant aerodrome becomes stronger, not weaker. For viewers unfamiliar with aviation planning, the implication is straightforward. If a runway already sits within a controlled and compliant OLS envelope, preserving that capability may be far wiser than destroying it and attempting to recreate it later at far greater cost. This is where technical regulation meets national foresight. For URA, MND, and MINDEF, the question is no longer whether OLS is relevant. The question is whether a safeguarded inland runway system like Paya Lebar will be recognized for what it is: a renewable national asset whose value may become even clearer under the very international standards Singapore now helps lead. If Slide 6 explained what OLS is, this slide explains why the revised framework matters. For many people, aviation safeguarding may sound like a rigid system of restrictions. But the revised ICAO approach is more intelligent than that. It no longer treats every runway, every approach path, and every planning context as though they must all be governed by the same outdated one-size-fits-all model. Instead, the revised OLS framework is more operationally tailored. It protects safety where protection is essential, while allowing obstacle evaluation and land use planning to be handled with greater precision. That distinction is very important for Singapore, because in a dense and land-scarce city-state, the real challenge is not choosing between aviation and development. The real challenge is learning how to safeguard strategic aviation capability without imposing unnecessary urban penalties. And that is precisely where the revised ICAO framework becomes relevant to Paya Lebar. As set out in Addendum 1, the appendix charts show that, compared with the legacy standards, the revised OLS model reduces certain safeguarding burdens, including gains of up to 15 or even 45 meters along runway corridors, and up to 45 meters at runway ends. For the general public, the meaning is straightforward. It means runway preservation does not automatically require crude or excessive exclusion zones. It means there is now more room for intelligent safeguarding. And it means that preserving Paya Lebar's runway value may be more compatible with surrounding development than many people assume. This is a major shift in the debate, because once the international standards themselves become more adaptable and more operationally refined, the argument that preservation is impractical becomes much harder to sustain. In other words, the revised ICAO framework does not strengthen demolition logic. It strengthens preservation and institutionalization logic. For URA, MND, and MINDEF, this creates a new level of responsibility. If Singapore has helped shape this revised framework, and if that framework now provides a more balanced path between safety and planning, then Paya Lebar can no longer be dismissed as a legacy airfield burden. It must be re-examined as a safeguarded inland runway asset whose value may now be easier, not harder, to preserve. This is where technical regulation becomes public opportunity, not an obstacle to good planning, but a tool for better planning. By this stage, one point should be becoming clear. A runway is never just a strip of pavement. If it is to function as a real aviation asset, it depends on an entire aerodrome system around it. That system includes taxiways, aprons, turnoffs, stands, service roads, control visibility, support areas, and the operating geometry that allows aircraft to move, park, load, refuel, and depart safely. This is why the preservation of Paya Lebar cannot be understood in fragments. To preserve only selected buildings while losing the runway system around them would be to retain the appearance of aviation heritage, but not its practical meaning. As Addendum 1 makes clear, the issue is not merely the survival of isolated structures. It is the preservation of the full aviation-capable envelope: the runway, taxiways, aprons, tower, terminal blocks, hangars, servicing bays, perimeter geometry, and ICAO-compliant operational space. That is the difference between symbolism and capability. Annex M makes this especially clear. It explains that war reserve capability is not just about runway length. It requires the wider movement area that allows heavy aircraft parking, engine runs, loading and unloading, refueling, turnarounds, night operations, and mixed civilian-military routing. In other words, a runway without supporting geometry is only a surface. A runway with taxiway logic, apron capacity, aerodrome charts, and operational infrastructure is an actual airfield. And that distinction matters greatly for the public, because once a complete aerodrome system is fragmented, its strategic utility becomes far harder to restore. In a land-scarce city-state, recreating a 3.8-kilometer runway with full safety envelopes, support areas, and legal operational charts would be extraordinarily difficult once Paya Lebar is removed. That is why Paya Lebar must not be assessed as though it were empty land with a few heritage elements attached. It must be assessed as a sovereign runway resource with no true inland substitute. And for URA, MND, and MINDEF, the implication is increasingly direct. The question is no longer whether fragments of heritage can be retained. The question is whether Singapore is prepared to preserve the integrity of an aerodrome system whose combined value for WRC, heavy airlift, humanitarian logistics, repatriation, medevac, and national continuity may prove irreplaceable. This is where the argument moves beyond preservation of memory. It becomes preservation of capability. By now, the significance of Paya Lebar should be viewed more clearly. This is not simply a matter of preserving a former airport. It is a matter of recognizing a strategic runway resource that Singapore may not be able to replace once lost. At the center of that argument is one decisive fact. Paya Lebar possesses a 3.8-kilometer runway, together with the taxiways, aprons, hangars, tower visibility, perimeter security, and ICAO-compliant operating envelope needed for real aviation capability. That combination is rare, and in Singapore's case, it is unique. As Addendum 1 states, Paya Lebar is the only inland runway in Singapore capable of serving as a credible war reserve runway complex for heavy civil and military airlift operations. For the public, that does not mean secrecy. It means resilience. It means a runway system that can still function when primary nodes are degraded, saturated, denied, or temporarily disrupted. It means a platform able to support not only aircraft recovery, but wide-body airlift, humanitarian logistics, medevac, repatriation, coalition support, and continuity operations. This is precisely why runway length matters. A 3.8-kilometer runway provides strategic reserve headroom. It gives safety margin for degraded operations. It supports heavier takeoff profiles. And it offers the flexibility needed for freight, tanker, evacuation, medical, and relief missions under stress. In a small island state, that kind of inland reserve is not a luxury. It is a form of national insurance. That is why Addendum 1 describes Paya Lebar not as a redevelopment plot, but as a sovereign runway resource with no inland substitute. And this is where the national question becomes sharper. The issue is not whether Changi is important. Of course it is. The issue is whether Singapore possesses sufficient runway redundancy to absorb and recover from temporary degradation of its primary aviation node. That is a very different question. And once asked honestly, Paya Lebar's relevance becomes difficult to ignore. For URA, MND, and MINDEF, the responsibility is therefore direct. If the nation already possesses an inland ICAO-compliant 3.8-kilometer heavy runway system with proven geometry, then the burden is no longer on the public to prove its value. The burden is on institutions to explain why such an asset should ever be extinguished. This is no longer only a heritage argument. It is an argument about survivability, continuity, and state foresight. Up to this point, the discussion may have sounded strategic, technical, or long-term. But crisis has a way of making such questions immediate. In moments of instability, aviation is no longer just about movement. It becomes about protection, return, coordination, and trust. This slide brings that reality into view. As reflected in the MFA update, once seats were secured for Singaporeans who had registered, additional capacity was extended to nationals from Australia, Brunei, Indonesia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Vietnam. That single detail carries an important public lesson. It shows that in a real regional crisis, aviation capacity is never only national in effect. It quickly becomes humanitarian. It becomes diplomatic. And it becomes a test of whether a country can convert planning, logistics, aircraft access, and airfield readiness into safe return. For the public, the meaning is straightforward. Repatriation is not merely a statement of concern. It is an operational act. It requires aircraft. It requires routing. It requires ground handling. It requires coordination across agencies. And above all, it requires runway capacity and aviation resilience when time is limited and options are narrowing. That is precisely why war reserve capability matters. Not as an abstract military phrase, but as part of a broader national ability to protect lives, sustain airbridge functions, and support orderly return in crisis. In this case, Singapore's response also reflected something larger, a willingness to extend help beyond its own citizens when safe capacity allowed. That is not only an aviation matter, it is also a statement of credibility, stability, and international responsibility. And this is where the case for Paya Lebar becomes harder to dismiss. If repatriation, humanitarian movement, and coalition relief are real public responsibilities in times of disruption, then the preservation of credible inland runway capacity is no longer a theoretical preference. It becomes part of national preparedness. For PMO, MFA, MINDEF, URA, and MND, that implication should be clear. Capabilities that may appear dormant in peacetime can become decisive in crisis. And once lost, they cannot be recreated at will. This next figure brings the reality into even sharper focus. Over the course of 4 repatriation flights, 618 Singaporeans and their dependents returned home safely. That number matters, not only because each return represents a life brought back to safety, but because it reminds the public that crisis response is rarely a single movement. It is sustained, it is cumulative, and it depends on aviation systems that remain available, coordinated, and resilient over time. When a regional crisis unfolds, the task is not simply to send one aircraft. It is to maintain an airbridge, to monitor the situation, to coordinate manifests, to secure routing, to manage turnaround, reception, and onward support, and to do so while events remain uncertain. That is why repatriation must be understood not merely as diplomacy, but as operational national capability. It depends on aircraft availability, airspace access, ground organization, and above all, credible runway resilience. As Addendum 1 makes clear, a nation that relies overwhelmingly on a single, concentrated coastal aviation node carries real continuity risk under war reserve conditions. Major disruption, or wide area crisis. That is precisely why an inland reserve runway matters. Not as duplication for its own sake, but as strategic insurance. A protected second aviation node provides options when timing is compressed, pressure is rising, and the cost of delay is measured in people. For the public, this is perhaps the clearest way to understand war reserve capability. It is not only about military readiness. It is also about the nation's ability to continue functioning, to receive its people home, to move the vulnerable, and to preserve confidence in crisis. And confidence, once lost in a disruption, is difficult to restore. That is why Paya Lebar's significance must now be read in practical terms. A 3.8-kilometer inland runway with full aerodrome support is not a symbolic reserve. It is a continuity instrument. And for PMO, MFA, MINDEF, URA, and MND, the implication is increasingly difficult to avoid. If repatriation of this scale is already a present-day reality, then the safeguarding of sovereign runway options should not be treated as an afterthought. It should be treated as part of responsible national planning. Because in crisis, resilience is not declared, it is built beforehand. After the strategy, the logistics, and the flight planning, this is the moment that matters most: the safe return home. In every crisis, public attention often focuses on the announcement, the aircraft, or the departure. But the true measure of national aviation resilience is what happens at the end of the journey. People arrive, families reunite, order is maintained, and confidence is restored. That confidence does not appear by accident. It rests on preparation, on coordinated agencies, on available aircraft, on ground reception, and on the quiet but decisive fact that a nation has preserved enough runway capacity and operational depth to keep options open when events become uncertain. For the public, this is perhaps the clearest human meaning of war reserve capability. It is not an abstract doctrine. It is the ability to bring people back safely, to receive them with dignity, and to do so under pressure, without confusion, and without improvising the impossible at the last moment. As Addendum 1 makes clear, this is exactly why an inland WRC runway matters. It strengthens repatriation, medevac, continuity, and humanitarian support by preserving a sovereign aviation option that remains available when primary systems are under strain. In that sense, a runway is not only a transport surface, it is a reassurance surface, a platform of national trust, a place where planning becomes protection, and where foresight becomes visible to ordinary citizens. This is also why the preservation of Paya Lebar must be understood in humane, not merely technical, terms. If Singapore wishes to remain ready for crisis, then it must think not only about buildings, density, and yield. It must also think about safe return, about reception, about continuity, and about whether the nation has kept enough strategic depth to protect its people when the world turns uncertain. For PMO, MFA, MINDEF, URA, and MND, that is the deeper implication. Capabilities that appear dormant in peacetime may become the very instruments by which public confidence is preserved in crisis. And once such capability is extinguished, reassurance itself becomes harder to guarantee. By this point, the lessons should be clear. When crisis strikes, aviation resilience is no longer theoretical. It becomes visible in aircraft movements, in returning families, in coordinated reception, and in the quiet restoration of confidence. The Middle East repatriation sequence has shown exactly that. It has shown that safe return depends not only on goodwill, but on capacity. Not only on intention, but on runway access, coordination, airlift availability, and continuity planning. For the public, this is the deeper meaning of all that has been shown in the last few slides. Repatriation, medevac, humanitarian corridors, and coalition relief do not begin at the moment of crisis. They depend on capabilities preserved beforehand. They depend on infrastructure that has not already been surrendered. They depend on strategic options that still exist when events move faster than planning assumptions. And that is why Paya Lebar matters. As Addendum 1 makes clear, Singapore today relies heavily on a single concentrated coastal aviation node. That may be efficient in peacetime, but under war-reserve conditions, wide area disruption, pandemic stress, or regional instability, a single node system carries real survivability risk. Paya Lebar offers something different. An inland 3.8-kilometer runway, a full taxiway and apron envelope, controlled airspace, an aerodrome system that can support repatriation, medevac, humanitarian airbridge, and continuity functions. This is why the debate can no longer remain at the level of nostalgia, nor can it remain trapped within a narrow land yield calculation. The issue is now one of national stewardship, whether institutions will recognize that some assets derive their value not from daily visibility, but from the strategic options they preserve. For PMO, MFA, MINDEF, URA, and MND, the implication should now be unmistakable. If crisis has already demonstrated the continuing relevance of repatriation and humanitarian airlift, then inland runway redundancy is not a romantic idea. It is responsible statecraft. And if Paya Lebar is extinguished, that option is not easily redesigned, relocated, or rebuilt. As Addendum 1 concludes, once quantified, PLAB is not a redevelopment plot. It is a sovereign runway resource with no inland substitute. This, then, is the policy lesson. National resilience must be preserved before it is needed, not mourned after it is gone. As we conclude this episode, we return to the central question. What, in truth, is Paya Lebar? Is it merely former land awaiting redevelopment? Or is it something far more important, a living national asset whose full value is only now being properly understood? This documentary has argued for the latter, that Paya Lebar is not simply a memory of aviation. It is an integrated aviation landscape whose significance continues across four enduring pillars. Under total defense, it represents war reserve capability, an inland sovereign runway option preserved before crisis, not regretted after it. Under safety, it represents the disciplined world of C3I in civil aviation and C4ISR in the military domain, a culture of lawful process, standard operating procedures, command responsibility, and control integrity. Under human governance, it points to the next era, a future in which advanced systems, AI, simulation, 5G, XR, and robotics must still remain under accountable human judgment. That is the purpose of the Gen 5 AI Layer 6 control tower architecture, extending beyond the widely discussed 5-layer AI stack to preserve safety, responsibility, and human command in an age of accelerating automation. And under lifelong learning, it offers something equally vital, a way for aviation heritage to remain alive, not only preserved in archives, but experienced through immersive education, simulation, public understanding, and intergenerational transfer. This is why Paya Lebar cannot be reduced to isolated buildings, nostalgic sentiment, or short-term land arithmetic. As Addendum 1 makes clear, Singapore's survival is aviation-dependent, and Paya Lebar remains the only inland 3.8-kilometer runway with the geometry, airspace, aerodrome support, and continuity value to serve as a second national aviation node. Once extinguished, that option is not easily recreated. And once fragmented, its full meaning cannot be recovered by plaques, models, or memory alone. For the public, the message is therefore simple. This is not only about the past. It is about whether Singapore chooses to preserve foresight, whether it chooses to retain a sovereign runway resource, a safety culture, a human governance platform, and a living educational legacy while there is still time. And for PMO, MINDEF, YORE, MEND, and all institutions entrusted with national stewardship, the implication is equally plain. Some assets derive their greatest value not from daily visibility, but from the options they preserve for the nation. Paya Lebar is one of those assets. To preserve it in full is not nostalgia. It is strategic maturity. It is responsible governance. And it is an investment in resilience, learning, and continuity for generations yet to come. Paya Lebar was never only an airport. It was, and still can be, a control tower of memory, capability, and national purpose.